Hi, my name is Cochran.
And my name is Nikitha Donthi.
And we are Parallel Consulting here today to advise the AAR on how to move forward when faced with at the crossroads between profit and safety. Now first, we want to dive into the situation that brought us here today, specifically the East Palestine derailment. So the East Palestine derailment had two key causes. The two key causes that we want to talk about today were the overheating of the wheel bearing that led to a derailment, and additionally the communication of these alerts to various different groups, both on the train and off the train. Now, specifically in the East Palestine derailment, the train crew did not receive an alert until 2 minutes prior to derailment. This is an issue because the train crew did not have enough time to stop the train before derailment and caused a huge spill of the vinyl chloride gas in the East Palestine community. Now, we also want to look at the response of the East Palestine derailment. In this situation, a vent and burn was conducted, and this has a significant impact on the community. This is because it releases toxins. Additionally, experts suggest that the vent and burn decision should not be conducted unless it is the only reasonable option to exist. This raises the concerns that were raised in East Palestine. This is because Norfolk Southern, the company involved in the derailment, convinced Ohio officials to go forward with the vent and burn decision. However, experts suggested that this was not necessary due to the threat of explosion not being a necessary result. Additionally, the community had no say in the decision that had a great impact on their environment.
Now that we've understood what were the general responses to the East Palestine incident, we can also talk about the legal responses in specific. So the legal responses included several key lawsuits that were filed by different government bodies. Also, on a more private level, the residents of East Palestine and affected business owners filed a class action lawsuit against Norfolk Southern. This was one of the largest lawsuits and resulted in a $600 million settlement, which is one of the largest settlements in railroad history. I also want to draw your attention to the policy reforms. After the derailment, there were several reforms that were being discussed in the government. One of them was the Railway Safety Act, which would have brought significant changes. However, this remains stalled in Congress. And with such key acts remaining stalled, the burden now falls on the AAR to move the industry forward after the derailment. And that leads us to our guiding question. How should the freight rail industry move forward after the East Palestine derailment? And under this, there are several key trade-offs that we want to consider. Firstly, understanding low probability versus high impact accidents, then understanding human oversight versus technology conflicts, and then individual interest versus communal interest conflicts.
Now that we understand these key questions, we need to understand how we evaluate them. And the first way to do this is understand the stakeholders in the freight railroad industry. We have these stakeholders listed here. However, what we want to highlight is the first two listed, the Class 1 railroad executives and the shareholders, look at the industry through a financial lens. Their goal of the freight rail industry is to maximize profits and demand returns. Now, when we look at the bottom of this list, the public and environment stakeholders, they look at the industry through an equitable lens. They want to promote the safety of the operations of the freight rail industry and also protect the resources in which these companies operate in. Now, we evaluated the Class 1 railroads' behavior, performance, and impact over the course of the last few years to understand if these objectives have been met by the freight railroad industry. We found that executives and shareholders, their objectives were consistently surpassed, showing high, strong financial returns and additionally operational efficiency. However, when you look at the public environment, their objectives are consistently missed. And in the case of East Palestine derailment, are harmed because safety, transparency, and the commitment to the environment were put at a lower priority when compared to the priority of maximizing profit. Now, we want to understand the importance of this stakeholder prioritization. And in order to do this, we can look at some case examples in history, specifically the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This company placed their stakeholders of the public and environment last, and this resulted in reputational damage of the company, additionally resulting in a 55% loss in shareholder value that the company has still not recovered from to this day. When applied to the freight railroad industry, who has seen already criticism of their own culture of safety, we can understand that these key stakeholders, the public and environment, need to be prioritized in order to avoid economic loss.
Now, with those objectives in mind, we can move forward with our ethical considerations. To guide the AAR, we have chosen the communitarianism ethical framework. Essentially, one of the definitions of this framework is that it should be balancing individual rights with the commitments to the common good. And in the case of our industry, this means balancing the profits versus the interests of the public and the environment. There are several key principles of communitarianism that have a strong relationship to the freight rail industry. So, for example, public protection, which holds that the public and the environment should be protected. Then responsible oversight, meaning that organizational operations should not impact the environment and the public negatively. Then civic engagement, meaning that the public should have a voice in the industry. And then collective governance, meaning that there should be community-guided decision-making. With these 4 key principles to guide us, we can now answer the guiding question that we had posed. And our answer is that the freight rail industry should balance profit with their commitment to the common good. Now, having understood this theory, we can start to guide the AAR with their strongest recommendations moving forward.
We recommend that the AAR implement recommendations following those 4 communitarian principles that we just outlined today. Let's first dive into the first recommendation following public protection, the first communitarianism principle. This public protection recommendation is to distribute hazardous materials across the freight train length. Well, we want to look into what is the current freight train length. Currently, all Class 1 railroads report running longer trains after implementing precision scheduled railroading. Now, this increase in length does come with a decrease of benefits, but the issue that we want to highlight here is that when a longer train derails, this increases the greater chance of a hazmat car derailing, thus increasing the chance of a negative impact on the community. So overall, our objective here is to reduce the risk of a hazmat car derailing without reducing the benefits that long freight trains bring. That brings us back to our solution of distributing hazardous material along the course of a long freight train. And our example here is that the AR should implement a policy of maximum cluster or cut size of 3 for all U.S. Department of Transportation hazardous materials, thus balancing profit with safety. Now, moving to our second recommendation of responsible oversight. This recommendation follows the AAR standardize the alert handling system. Currently, the AAR has already made changes to standardize the system, which we have highlighted here. However, what we want to touch on is that even with these current changes, that in the context of the East Palestine derailment, this would not have changed the result of a derailment in the effects of the chemical spills on East Palestine. This is because the train crew still would have received an absolute alert only 2 minutes prior to derailment. This leads us to our recommendation of greater oversight, where we recommend that all Class 1 railroads receive trending warm alerts to train crews specifically on hazmat rail cars. This will prevent the East Palestine derailment specifically because the train crew will receive a trending warm alert 41 minutes before the derailment and giving them ample enough time to stop the train before derailment occurs.
Now, our next solution is to implement a citizen advisory board. Within the AAR, currently the voices include railroads and other businesses, but the voice that is missing is the local community. And to solve this, we suggest having a citizen advisory board. Now, within the citizen advisory board, we could have residents of the local communities, local environment experts, etc., and they could add in a new perspective in the AAR. The reason we believe this would be successful is because it has been successful in other industries in the past. For example, the PWS RCAC was established after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and this has been hailed as a best practice within the oil industry. And so we believe a similar board could bring value to the to the freight rail industry as well. Now we can talk more about our remedial action decision process, which is our fourth and final recommendation. Now, at the moment, this is our current decision-making timeline that Mia touched upon earlier, but we suggest that there are additional steps that are added in order to make the decision-making process more holistic, and in order to ensure that what happened in the case of East Palestine doesn't happen again. So to dive a bit deeper, we suggest that when there is a remedial action to be taken, that the community town hall is conducted quicker. This can be the responsibility of the Citizen Advisory Board, and their inputs can be given to the local incident commanders. Similarly, the AAR should set a standard, asking companies to have non-biased evaluators during the remedial action-making process. And so this results can be communicated to the local incident commander before a final decision is made.
Now, finally, we want to highlight that our recommendation follows all 4 communitarian principles and prioritizes those key stakeholders, the public and the environment.
And finally, just want to talk upon the financial impact or our economic considerations. Over here, you can see that our 4 recommendations have 4 different costs. Some of them can be borne directly by the Class 1 railroads, others can be borne by the AAR and then split in the form of extra dues. We want to say that over here, you can see that the $6.9 million would be the total cost incurred per company per year, but that is very small compared to what a company incurs in the case of a derailment, because in East Palestine, Norfolk Southern had to pay $1.9 billion. We suggest that by implementing our recommendations, which reduce the risk, severity, and the financial risk of a derailment, companies would be able to consider this almost as an insurance premium. This insurance premium is just 0.4% of the cost that they pay in an accident, so why not? These insurance premiums are much less than what you and I pay on a regular basis. By implementing these recommendations, the railroad industry will be able to move forward in a much more sustainable way. Thank you.
And your question will come from Mr. Jerry Zach over there with the microphone.
Identify 6 tangible actions the rail industry could support to regain trust in communities such as East Palestine, Ohio.
Recommendations and then transparency and honesty in the decision-making process. Yes, so to answer your question of the 6 recommendations that the railroad industry should implement to build trust back in the industry are 4 of the following recommendations that we suggested today. The first being standardizing the alert decision-making process to prevent derailments. That's a preventative response. Another preventative response we believe that is also necessary is distributing those hazardous materials to decrease the risk. And then also responsive recommendations. These responsive measures would be creating a citizen advisory board to give voice to those communities and also standardizing the guidelines to increase the amount of voice of the community in the community. However, the 2 key areas that we didn't touch on that we should also implement is transparency and honesty of the AAR. So continuing to update the freight rail industry of the recommendations being implemented and being honest with the community in which it impacts. Thank you.
Thank you.